A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
Hey everybody, we're back for another Andy and Shlomo Design a Game. This one is going to be about criminal justice and punishment, and I cannot wait to get started. Andy is our game designer. Lead on, right? You're a leader today.
All right. So as we did in the previous episode where we designed a different game, I want to start with this touchstone document. What are the things that we know that we want to include? So we know that we want to make a game about crime and punishment. So we know what our theme is. We know what the game is about. But let's talk about some other things that we may not know. What about this game is meant to be fun? What kind of fun are we trying to create?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I know you really like this concept of fun. And
I do.
I'm struggling with this a little bit, right? Because a part of me is already divided about how to do this, right? A part of me wants to do like an activist game, right? Like essentially to say, look, I have some feelings, some thoughts about crime and justice, especially in America, but really anywhere. A part of me wants to make a game where, we get players to think about crime and justice. And a part of me wants to say, well, look, there's all these really terrible things going on, and we should make an activist game about, crime and justice that will get people to go out there and do something about it.
Okay. So actually, let's use that lens instead. Instead of thinking about what's fun, let's use the lens of what do we want to say?
What do we want to say? Yeah, it's I'm open to kind of, my usual go-to is I want people to think for themselves. Mm-hmm. So what do you think about that? So the think for them.
But I mean, thinking for go think for yourself is not very active in terms of like activism. So if we wanted to make a more activism game, you sort of need to have a call to action that is a little bit more active than, hey, why don't you just think about these things? Right.
So and if we make this an activist game, we need a call to action, right? So you can imagine, let's say, the call to action would be that, let's say we might focus on private prisons in America, right? And, how those are a terrible idea. Or maybe the minimum wage that a lot of, prison workers, prison guards get paid in some parts of the country, and the concerns about that, and, a petition, right, that people can sign. One of my...
Or about, like, here in California, our inmates frequently get inmate jobs as firefighters. And right now we're in the middle of fire season, so this is a big deal right now, right? But they're paid, like, $1.50 an hour.
Right. So notice, right? The whole point could be, let's focus on prison labor. There's two big activist games that I like. One was about Darfur, and I can't remember what it was called. But in there, one of the things I really liked is they had this activist tools built into the game that let you write an email or send an email from the game directly to your local representative or to President
Bush. That's a great idea.
So cool. And and part of the idea, which I don't think they ever actually managed to completely get off the ground, but part of the idea was to allow you to meet other interested people through the game that would allow you then to create, they wanted to do divestment campaigns on college campuses and stuff like that, which I don't know how effective that would have been. But the idea of connecting with other people on this issue, right, and the game being a place for people to do that sounded really, really amazing.
Yeah, like to create a hub for a network of people who also feel the same way about what's going on.
And then have them take that and, have real world meetings, right, outside of the game, right? The game is just going to kind of connect them into groupings that they can use for that. I thought that was amazing. But I feel like maybe this issue is bigger, right? Because it's one thing to say, okay, here's a specific issue. There are people starving that desperately need help in, let's say, Darfur, right? Or, right now in Hong Kong, right? China's cracking down, right, on on Hong Kong democracy, democracy activists, and we need your support right now. And that's what Revolution in Our Times, the game, another activist game, did. Right? You can essentially buy the game, and you can purchase stuff through the game, and you can literally help, right, the activists, both by spreading information, but I think primarily by making purchases in the game, right?
Right.
But those are very, very specific.
Yeah.
So maybe this isn't the right topic for an activist game.
Well, or the crime and punishment, or do we want to make it broader? We want to talk about like what should we do with criminals?
Well, I was thinking crime and punishment. I mean, there's so much to crime and punishment.
So it's so big.
So maybe we should talk
about a lot
about
of things we could do.
Yeah, so maybe we should throw out some potential topics here. I realize I'm kind of taking your template and I'm throwing it away. So maybe
that's okay.
Maybe I should follow your template here.
Sometimes it's important to like go, all right, this theme that we have is too broad.
Mm-hmm.
Let's narrow it down. Let's talk about like just this element of it, or just this element of it.
Okay. Or maybe even, what do we mean by crime and punishment? Just so we're clear, right?
Yeah.
When we think crime and punishment, what do you have in mind?
So what I have in mind is a society has a set of rules, and when you transgress these rules, society has to decide what to do about that. In some cases, it may be nothing. In some cases, it might be, chuck the person out. I mean, that was common in earlier times. You just get ejected from the country, right?
It's interesting. We don't do that much anymore.
No, but one, because there's not any place to eject people to. There used to be wildlands.
Right.
There used to be these in-between places where you weren't anywhere. You were just out in the wilderness. Now we don't really have that anymore. Everything's a country. Right.
We can't expel you from our community, or put you on an island somewhere, or, Canada's not going to take, the people that America, kicks out.
Right. And depending on what the crime is, do we even want another country to take them?
Right. And, this, of course, is when you think about, so we can think about what's the purpose of punishment. Mm-hmm. Kind of in the first place, right? So maybe who should we punish? Right?
Yeah.
What should we punish them for?
Right. What crimes are important enough to punish people for?
Right. Because, we do lots of things where we don't really punish people. Or we do, of course, we also do a lot of punishments that are really, really light. Right. Right. Like, you're fined for, jaywalking or, speeding. Right. Or, illegal parking.
There are things that we do to try to make you think about doing things that would be dangerous before you do them. We're like, let's put a fine on here to make you think, oh, wait, if I do this thing, I might get fined, because clearly if I do this thing, I could get killed is not enough.
Right. So, we have kind of these deterrents, right? Right. So, and this is part of the idea, right? Why do we punish people? We punish people to deter them from doing it again, and to deter other people from doing it in the first place.
Right. Okay. So let's imagine a game then. One of the sort of thought constructs that I come back to frequently is a tribe of Neolithic people. And we have a game where we have a tribe of Neolithic people. We know exactly who they all are. We've given, every one of them has a name. Every one of them has a personality.
All right.
Every one of them is running an AI. And we are guiding them over generations. So maybe, every 10 minutes is a year or something, or every,
right.
So we have this sort of sense of time is happening. They're reproducing. They're falling in love. They're making babies. They're growing old. They're dying. And one of the interesting thoughts that I've always had is to make a game around like setting laws for these people and setting up rules and try to create sort of a sustainable society within this little grouping.
Well, this is part of the difficulties, I think, about subjects like this, right? Because, I want this to relate to the real world, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if we're making this about the real world, we're making assumptions,
Yeah.
right? We're making assumptions about what works, what doesn't, right? So, for
That's
example,
right.
does the death penalty deter crime, right? Should we
Right.
should we execute our worst offenders?
Right.
Well, people disagree about that. As it happens,
Yeah.
the majority of American criminologists believe that the death penalty doesn't deter crime. But there's no hard and fast evidence about this stuff, right? So
Mm-hmm.
notice, and that's just one very, very specific kind of penalty. So part of the problem that seems to me to be maybe endemic to any kind of game like this, right, where we're trying to hit on a real world issue, is
Mm-hmm.
what assumptions are we going to make, and how do we make those assumptions in a way that people will buy into? I think we've
That's right.
talked about Peacemaker before, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in Peacemaker, right, the goal is to make peace between Israel and the Palestinians. But all this makes assumptions about what kind of things really, would make peace. And can you really trust the Israelis or the Palestinians to do what they say they do? And of course, people in the real world that don't agree with those assumptions will just consider a throwaway game
That's right.
that just pushes
So-
a particular narrative.
So with this thought idea, one of the assumptions we have to make is that the AI for each of these individual people is as complex and irrational as human beings actually are. So we don't know. We don't necessarily know what each of these little AIs is going to do. They have their own thoughts about things. They react to things in ways that we don't necessarily predict.
Are they like people?
They're like little people.
So if they're like little people and they form social relationships and societies,
Yeah.
can't we just take the knowledge and understanding we have about people and society and apply it to our game?
Well, sure, but what do we know about people in society?
Exactly. We make a lot of assumptions about them.
Right.
Right.
Right. So
So-
let's just assume that they are perfect little replicas of human beings.
Right, but here's what I mean by the assumptions thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
We disagree about what people are like, right? We disagree about how people respond to punishment, right?
Right.
Think even as something as simple as raising a child, right? Parents have different parenting philosophies, right? And then we have these experts today that are experts on, early childhood development that will try to give people essentially an idea of what sort of punishment should you do with your kids, and when is that appropriate? But of course, lots of people disagree with exactly what works, and I feel the same thing applies obviously to prisons, or let's say to our forms of punishment. So if you look at a place like Norway, right? Norway, the maximum punishment for Norway is 21 years,
Okay.
right? There's no solitary confinement as far as I understand it as well. There's no death penalty. Right? You can get multiple life sentences in the U.S., right? And of course you get the death penalty, right? These two countries seem to be making very, very different assumptions about what works and doesn't work. And I feel like we need to be able either to have some sort of way of having confidence in our assumptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or leaving things open to the assumptions maybe that the player will make about this. Does that... I don't know, I don't know if you could do that either.
Well, I mean, in this hypothetical game that we're going to design, of course we can do that. We don't have to program it.
Right.
And it's somebody else's problem, right? So, but that also gives us license to say, it's probably good that we don't know how these little people are going to react. Let's say, for example, here's a way that we could do this, right? And we could do this today. We could have every time that a question arises that these little characters need to weigh in on, we the game sends out an email to a random person and asks them a question.
Are we talking about random real people or random game?
Yeah,
people?
random real people.
Random real people.
The game sends out an email, like a survey question, a 1-question survey. Does this tribe want to have a death penalty?
Okay.
And then the game sends out an email to some random person and asks them if they want to have a death penalty. And then that's the way that character in the game feels.
Interesting. Very cool. I like that idea, at least in principle. Where do you get these random people? Are they players? Are they literally random emails and you're spamming them?
I bet we could buy a big list of emails that we could spam.
Okay. Or again, notice. I mean, potentially these could be other players.
Yeah,
right?
They could be other players.
Right.
They could be people who have agreed to take on. Maybe there's some sort of organization like 23andMe where they consistently send out surveys to people and people agree to take these surveys for 23andMe. Maybe there's sort of a ethics and me organization where we just say, all right, if you want to answer questions about it, if we want to answer ethical questions, we're the company that does that.
Sure. Maybe this podcast at some point will be like, come to our registrar. People are interested in ethics and video games, and you could be the kind of random person that could affect people's games by making choices, right?
And in fact, this would be a really great sort of, this could be a really great business for somebody to if you join this, you have a little village, and every time you answer ethical questions, your little villagers behave as if they are you. And so you get to see this little microcosm of people of a society that behaves like you do. And what does that society end up looking like? What does that society end up being? People would pay good money for this.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but I subscribe to a list of California voters that get surveyed, and I really enjoy it. Right. Mm-hmm. And, I would love it if they sent me ethical questions.
So you and I both enjoy these survey things. Mm-hmm. I'm a member of several of these things that send surveys out. Yeah. And of course, 23andMe, I'm in the 98th percentile of people who have responded to questions and 23andMe. I'm on board.
Right. And imagine we also talk to the public through a podcast. Who would have thought those personality traits would have something in common? Okay. But look. In this game, right, it seems to me that this is kind of hard to do if we're going to talk about crime and punishment. In part because, thinking long term, right? So thinking long term, there are certain things that you can really project long term. I think, your technology, food production, militaries, there's things that can kind of grow over time. But I think the situation with crime and punishment I don't know if this kind of format for a game is going to be my choice. The way the kind of genre of game that I would choose. I would think you might need something more of a narrative, maybe.
Maybe more real world
instead of real world,
like some fictional Neolithic group.
Yeah,
it could be a specific person who has a specific problem or a specific group of people.
Sure. Or you can be right. So again, right, it depends. Here's what I kind of would like the player to be at least thinking about, right? Mm-hmm. I want them to think about, what's the point of punishing people, right? So I definitely want them to think about that, right? What's the point of punishing people? I want them to think about how much of the things that we do are the product of our environment. Mm-hmm. And, you can think about that in terms of the kind of society we have, in terms of the kind of neighborhoods, communities we grow up in, in terms of our genetics and families, and especially abusive families, right? If we're born to foster parents, right? Or not born to foster parents, right? But if we grew up in a foster home, right? And partly also the kind of environments, I guess, that environmental factors like prisons, right? How do those shape us? So those are, let's say, kind of two things that I would want them to think about.
Right.
And maybe also maybe there's a bunch of other issues like how does things like racism fit into our criminal justice system?
Yeah.
Right? That seems to be kind of an important, an important issue. And the money that we spend on punishing versus preventing crime versus creating the conditions that happen so that crime never happens. Now, those are big kind of questions that I think it's hard to find a lot of very concrete kind of answers for. But
it's a really good which makes it very, very good to use these sort of artificial life sort of simulations to work out issues, to work out the details of.
Well, I was thinking actually that it would be, I was thinking it'd be easier to do them in a real world scenario, right? You've got a real world, you just don't necessarily know what the consequences will be. Right. Let's say we happen to have a game and you're like a warden in a prison in Louisiana, just to pick a random. Okay, it's a narrative. We made you the warden. I don't know why the warden. The warden's obviously is only dealing, only dealing with the with prisoners that have been sent to them. But you would think a warden would need to have a kind of philosophy, right?
Right, but honestly, I don't actually think that this is a good way to, because the warden's hands are pretty well tied. There's laws that they're bound to, and the job itself is very specific, right?
Okay.
So I don't know that they have much opportunity to really think about, like, should this person be in jail at all? Maybe a judge is a better place to start.
Well, it's interesting, right? It's interesting because one way to do it, of course, is to judge sounds fun. You want to do a game about a judge?
Yeah, let's do a judge game.
Let's do a judge game. Okay. And what's interesting about judges is, well, obviously judges make judgments.
Right.
Right. And the thing about making a judgment is, a judgment is you're making an evaluative call, and it's something definite, right? It's not something that you're pondering. It's not an if. It's like you're going to make a judgment call, and there's going to be consequences to that call, and you don't know what those consequences are going to be, for sure, at least, right? When you make that call,
right? You know what it's going to be for the specific case that you're making the call on. Right. But you don't necessarily know how that's going to affect the next case, which will have a different set of circumstances, a different set of context.
Right. So are we going to allow juries or ignore juries?
Let's ignore juries. Let's just say it's a judge, and let's also, for the sake of simplicity, let's say there's no constitution.
Screw that. Why do we need a constitution? Right.
Let's just say the judges.
Lots of countries don't have constitutions.
Yeah. Right? The judge can just decide, based on their moral and ethical, leanings, and their thinking, on what is the right thing to do.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good, right? I mean, if you've got and it's interesting, right? Because judges in making decisions are essentially supposed to apply the law, right, as they understand it. And we don't want them to just apply the law. We want them to think about what the law should be. So we're going to be judges. We want them to think about this. This may or not be an activist game. We don't know yet, right? We don't need to decide at this point, right?
We should know what we want to say.
Okay.
So,
my vote goes against. My vote says,
let's just say this is a game that's not necessarily, doesn't have a specific point of view. It's not specifically going to say you should go out and do the thing. It's a game where it's just meant to like open up these questions and make you play through these issues so that you're thinking about them.
I want to go back to some of your questions here. So, who is this game meant to be played by? What do you think?
Well, that's an excellent question. This feels like something that you would want to maybe attach to high school civics.
Oh, that'd be great. Oh man, I would so love it if we had some sort of game like this in a high school civics class.
Yeah.
I don't know how many high school civics class there still are today, and I don't know if they call them civics, but something like that.
In California, it was literally the only class I had to pass to get out of high school.
Really?
Yeah.
I will say this: if we don't teach high school civics anymore, and I had a class called government. But I don't.
Yeah, I think ours was called government as well, but it was basically high school civics.
Right. And I don't think I think only like a tiny minority of the people in my school took it.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
But it's one of those things that, and God, especially today's in these divided times, we could certainly use a class like that. But you can put that into lots of other classes. Where, history, humanities, right? I like this idea of focusing on the high school population.
Okay. So yeah, it's meant to be attached to a high school government/civics class. The average age of our players is going to be 15 years old.
15. Okay. It makes me actually think if we're gonna do a game based on assuming that this is going to be educational. And originally, I definitely wasn't thinking remotely of making it an educational game, but I kind of like this as an educational game.
Yeah, I think it lends itself very well.
It reminds me of there was a game about the Underground Railroad, and I don't remember if we've talked about it in this podcast, but it sounded like a really interesting game about the Underground Railroad, and it was made by the people who made the Oregon Trail. But they essentially assumed that when students played this game in high school, they would play this game as a part of a larger lesson about slavery. And that didn't happen. Essentially, schools just stuck them in front of computers, which this is old. I think these were Apple IICs or something. Yeah. And it did not go well. They essentially encountered this stuff with no context. Parents got really upset. So
I didn't think that this game actually came out.
It was out.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this was a game.
I thought that it had gotten nixed by the publishers because they were too worried about. Oh no, that was the remake of it. Somebody wanted to redo it, and that's more recently got nixed. That's what the story was. Yeah.
I don't know.
One of our listeners, I'm sure will correct me if I'm wrong about that.
Okay, so
you should.
My point there is we can't count on context. Right. It might be that they just someone might sit this kid in front of the computer and say, "All right, play this game about crime and punishment."
Right.
Okay. Now we're playing as the judge. I had this idea. I didn't do what I would say is preparing for this. But last night in bed, I was thinking about this for a little bit, and I came out with one kind of possibility, though I don't know if it really applies anymore. I was thinking about the interview process. I was thinking, let's say if we were played as the warden, what would the interview process for a warden be? And let's say this is a judge. Before you get hired, what would the interview process for a judge be?
Right.
And
this is a judge who has unlimited powers.
Right.
They can just decide things however they want.
Right. So I was thinking of things like so Ultima 4, in the very beginning of Ultima 4, you get asked a bunch of moral dilemmas, right? And you then become that character. I was wondering if we could do something a little bit like that, where you're asked a bunch of kind of questions in the beginning as part of your job interview. One of my students made a game once about where you work for pharmaceutical companies, and you had to answer for your job interview. you had to essentially answer a bunch of moral dilemmas, and they would
Right.
determine which company you went to, which culture you kind of fit in.
Oh, right. That's interesting. Ooh, I have an idea. How about this? Your job interview, at the beginning of the game, you're asked a series of questions, moral dilemmas, sort of theoretically, how would you behave? How would you handle, this issue? What do you feel about this issue?
Right.
And that becomes, now I'm going to go back on what I just said, 5 minutes ago. That becomes the Constitution. That is, that becomes the law that you now have to uphold.
Oh, it's
with a whole
interesting.
bunch of cases where the specifics are very different and the contexts are very different.
Wow. Okay. Part of me wants to say, let's do that, but let's take it to an extreme.
Ooh, yeah.
So that whatever your decisions are, they're problematized in that the law is still true draconian one way or another. But I don't know if I like this as much as your original idea of kind of just giving the judge all the power.
Okay.
Right? To kind of because you could change your mind, or
Right. Okay, so let me go to another one of my questions here.
Okay.
I'm gonna skip down a little bit. How do players win and how do they lose?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Okay, here's one. I'm assuming if we're going to be a judge, you're going to be seeing cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
But let's do more than that, right? Besides seeing cases, you're having meetings with lawyers, and we need your conscience. So how about
all right.
you have dinner with your spouse, where you I don't know if judges are or are not allowed to talk, but in hypothetical cases, I know that my lawyer friends talk about their cases all the time. They just don't name names.
Right. Right.
But they
Of course.
talk about their cases all the time. But this idea of having someone that you trust, that you kind of feel responsible to, I kind of like this kind of, because if you're in a room and you're discussing, let's say, the case with the district attorney, let's say, or the prosecutor and the defense attorney, you can get different perspectives on different things, right? And that's great. But I really like the idea also of giving you someone that at the end of the day, they're just thinking if you're being a good person. At the end of the day, you're this is the person you're morally accountable to.
Okay.
Right? And at least for me, it's my wife.
There's an assumption. But there's an assumption there, right? I mean, who is designing this person's morality? Your spouse's morality,
right? Right.
And so, what is that based on? Because that's going to end up being the solution, right?
Well, so I would say that your spouse is not. You can make it where they're open-minded, but let's say they clearly expect you to do the right thing.
What is the right thing?
They expect you to try to do the right thing.
Okay.
And they expect you to be able to explain yourself for why you think it's the right thing. And they expect you to be fair, show compassion, but also, be just. Notice these are just kind of like general things that someone can support without having without saying, but I know better than you what the right answer is.
But all right, so I agree, but a game still needs to know what is just and what isn't just.
I don't think
in order for her to have your spouse, to have an idea of whether or not you are being, because like you said, if you're accountable to her, then she's going to judge you.
Right. So I think it's not, again, what does it mean to be just or to try to be just, right? Essentially that you're trying, I think is kind of the idea.
What if she simply cares about you being consistent?
Or consistent, or both of those things. Why not?
I mean, let's assume that she's married you, she's fallen in love with you, and she's married you because you're simpatico.
Okay.
So we don't necessarily need to know exactly what she feels, because what she feels is what you feel about most things.
Okay.
Now she might like to do sort of the devil's advocate thing. So you can talk to her and she'll say, but what about the people who think about this? Think about it this way. What about the people who think about it this way? And she can bring up these other points of view.
Right.
So she has a function to do that. And then she judges you on whether or not you're consistent to your previous decisions.
I like, to me, if you have two lawyers, right, you can get perspectives, right? You can get, those kinds of things. But I like the consistency part, that there's someone holding you accountable. And I still really like this. I don't want to let go of this idea that, that we can make this person make you feel accountable. And again, we don't have to go into, I think, a lot of details about that, but just this feeling like at the end of the day, your partner wants you to be a good person.
Right.
And,
right.
And you kind of got to tell your partner what you did in a way that you can live with, and that they can live with.
So here's another idea. So there's basically the spouse who sort of judges, who brings up these different points of view in conversation with you, and ultimately judges you on your consistency, because she feels the same way that you do, and so she's only going to to not give you a win if you're doing something that is inconsistent with what you and she believe. But let's say that there's another aspect of this game too, and that is, maybe you can be voted out of office, maybe, and so there's another scale of just your popularity, and whether your judgments are popular judgments or not, and we can, going back to a much earlier idea in this episode, we can crowdsource the American culture about these things. So we can ask 1,000 people. Or, how do you feel about this? Give them the same problem.
Yeah.
And if you're different than the way they feel about it,
it affects your popularity.
Yeah, it affects your popularity. So there's another way you could potentially lose.
Right. Which is because we still haven't talked about the win condition. Right. So it's in the win. Sometimes
the lose condition is more interesting than the win condition.
Okay. Yeah. In fact,
sometimes.
Right. In this case, the lose condition, your popularity falls behind a lower than some sort of threshold, right? And you lose your job. You're not representing the people's interest.
Right. And either you're either voted out or pitchforks and torches.
Sure. Pitchfork. Let's do pitchforks and torches.
Pitchforks and torches.
They're just fun. Yeah.
That's right. Since you have unlimited power, you also, the only thing that
you understand is the power of the people through pitchforks and torches.
That's right.
The other kind of so I for something like this, I really like the idea of connecting your judgments with other people's judgments. That would be also other players that are playing the game that are. I would want to see what kind of decisions other people made. I would definitely want to have those kind of comparisons, whether they're kind of like end of chapter comparisons.
I think that's great. I would love to have the comparison of other players,
right,
and also comparison to people who are not players.
Yes, yeah, which is also kind of interesting because, right, people who are not players typically will get, I'm assuming, may not think about it as much, and it might kind of be interesting to see what our snap judgments might be.
Or even better, since we know that it happens in a sophomore year high school class.
Okay.
We can show you what the previous years have decided.
Or different schools across the country.
or different schools across the country, right?
That's actually
There's all kinds
that
of
would
really
actually
interesting.
be very interesting data.
It would be very interesting data, wouldn't it?
Right, because you think about, you would think there would be, for example, different answers done in like, let's say, a high school in a small town in Mississippi versus in Seattle, right? That they would get very, very different kinds of, answers, and what they would differ on would be very interesting, and the reasoning would be very, very interesting. Yeah, I'm thinking of there's something called the Ethics Bowl that high schools participate in.
Oh yeah,
which is a regional and national competition of ethics. I'm like, this would be perfect for them.
How do you
if there was a
compete
game
in
like
ethics?
This. You get essentially kind of dilemmas or problems, topics, and essentially the team needs to come up with solutions or answers for them, and a team of judges. So I've judged these
long form.
Like,
do they have to write sort of their argument out for why they've decided this?
Typically in a bowl, it's live, and they it's kind of like a debate, but instead of trying to beat the other person, you're more like trying to give a better answer, better response than the other team. And you have essentially experts. So, I've been, I think, a judge at 3 of these, where your experts kind of weigh the kind of value of your reasoning process and, how good your answer was. So,
all right.
It's an interesting thing, right? Something like that can turn into or can feed into this. But yeah, I think there's a lot, for me, you get a lot of ethical reflection coming from other people's judgments. Right. That's why I want this kind of feeling with the spouse of the person who is, in some sense judging you, even if they're not saying anything, right? You feel like they're the person you're most accountable to, and that's why I like this kind of let's say the 2 lawyers arguing with you. They're not just giving you perspectives, they're also kind of giving you feedback on your own judgment, right? But the best is people in your position. Right, and getting to see what people in your identical position, what their judgments were. Maybe even better than that is being able to have conversations, with those people after the fact. In a game, right, we could do this in forums, right, of some kind, right? In a classroom, you could obviously go, far beyond that.
Right. There can be, group discussion. There can be, even if I'm assuming that the game is serving up random problems to each player, so that they can't actually collude. But there could easily be discussion about like, well, what interesting problem did you face today, Tommy? What interesting problem did you face today, Jenny?
Right.
And then the class can discuss it, even though they're not all playing the same. They're not all responding to the same case.
Or maybe they all have the same cases but randomized, so in different orders, right? So
that they can't collude. You don't want a bunch of players going, let's all decide this the same way.
Right. So yeah, so that's why I'm thinking randomized. I'm thinking about literally the way I give tests. And how I randomize my questions for tests. But then after the test, we can talk about the same questions together. Right. So, if you, let's say in this game, let's say you have 10 cases that you need to deal with, right? We can all talk about the same cases, but we're going to be in different cases at different times, so we can't collude.
Right.
Should we talk about what the cases themselves might be like?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think we definitely do. And I also think we need to do, so this is adding a little bit more detail to the idea that there's these 2 different judgments. You've got your spouse, and then you've also got this popular opinion. I think the popular opinion, the people who get the surveys to give you popular opinion, they only get the high level, like the newspaper headline version of the case, and have to decide it based on that. Whereas you get a lot more detail. You get all of the facts.
Well, yeah, it's interesting what all of the fact means, right? All of the facts is usually too many facts, right?
Right, well, it can be. And so you have to figure out, and that's actually really interesting, like calling out the facts that don't matter.
Right. What matters and what really doesn't matter. I mean, it's also interesting I think that one thing that should be is that we're not going to hear cases. I think we should be at the. I don't think we should be at the guilty, not guilty. Well, sorry. Let me. That's okay. So, right, a trial has two phases, right? The first phase is the person guilty or not. The second phase is, the actual sentencing part.
Right. And that's for criminal law. And we are talking only about criminal law and not talking about civil law.
Right. If we do tort law. Yeah, that's actually a good question. Sure. Let's focus only on criminal law. So do we just want to focus on sentencing? Because sentencing, and one of the things that I would want in sentencing is I would really want, so let's talk about sentencing and then let's maybe go back and see about the other one.
Okay. Maybe it's all about sentencing. That would be interesting.
Right. It could be just about sentencing because, you can have like a critical thinking game or something that focuses on what does the evidence actually show and all this kind of stuff. But to me, the interesting about the thing about the punishment, right, all has to come from sentencing when you've already found out that the crime occurred. Everything else is, did a crime actually occur? Right.
Right.
And part of our problem is that we also seem to be deciding what counts as a crime exactly, but because we kind of gave our judge the leeway. I don't know how exactly that's going to work.
Right. So yeah, I think this is better. Another judge has already found them guilty, and then you get the details.
Right. Or it could have been you. It's your courtroom.
It could have been you.
Well,
right.
we're just not talking about that part.
Okay.
Right. We can focus on certain things like what are the range of punishments available to you? Right. So, let's say, we're kind of stuck thinking of punishment in very, very kind of simple, straightforward terms, fine or jail, and maybe the death penalty, right?
Right.
But there's lots of other things, right? There's drug courts, right?
Sure. We also think, like one of the common things that judges do is send us to driving school.
Driving school or any kind of program. Right. I had a friend that got sent to anger management classes that he called the Clockwork Orange classes, right? Where anger management classes, interesting, right?
Awesome.
What if you're caught for domestic violence, right? Maybe you need classes like that besides whatever else will happen. What about community service? What about shaming tactics? Right, so let's say those people who get caught stealing and the judge sentences them to stand outside, let's say Walmart with a sign for a week that says from 9 to 5 that said I stole from Walmart.
Right. So, I mean, we used to do that with stocks, right? We used to put people in stocks for a day.
Right, though
in the
we
town
took away
square
they're there to be ashamed, and they're also there. They're also literally can't move because they're in the stock.
Right. But that was only because you didn't want to assign somebody to stand there with them to make sure they stood there.
Okay.
Everybody has a job.
Right. That makes sense. These days we can have your ankle bracelet to make sure that you really are in front. We could put you on a video monitor, but whatever it is that we do.
There's easy ways to handle that.
And there's lots of other potential ways of punishing. Right. So I'd want the judge to have a large range of these.
Yeah, right? I agree. I think that there should be. I think there should be more than 5.
Oh, yeah, I'd put up to 10. I mean, caning. Why don't we cane people? Right? They do it in punishment. Singapore, right? Corporal punishment. What about cutting off body parts, like cutting off the hand of a thief, like they do in Saudi Arabia? Why are we not considering that?
So, what about recidivism? Should we track recidivism? Should there be, depending on the punishment, should there be a chance that this person is going to do the same thing again?
Okay, so good question. So first of all, we got all these sentencing options, right? And we got
I love that.
We have those along with the number, right? So if we're going to say you get hit by a cane, right? How many times? If you're going to go to jail for how long? If you're going to pay a fine, how much, right? So we need those factors. Then we have these kind of, so that's kind of basic. then we have kind of the questions of, I don't know, mitigating circumstances, any circumstances that might kind of. So let's say we found out this person already, let's say, did time. Oh, this person committed previous offenses. We know what their crimes are. So notice this is someone who is, it's different than talking about what the recidivism rate would be or anything, but it is someone that we know was already given some sort of punishment. And maybe we get to think about, okay, did that work or not work? Was the problem that they didn't get enough punishment? Is it the wrong punishment? Is it that punishment is not the way to deal with these things?
So yeah, I think that when you get the case, you get the two opposing arguments. One, they're lawyers basically giving you all of the deep reasons why their punishment should be high, or should be what the lawyer thinks it ought to be. The prosecutors will recommend a punishment, and then the defense will also recommend a punishment and give you all these reasons why it should be that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like both of them giving you reasons for harsher or lesser punishment. It's interesting. Part of me wants to leave it completely open to you, but of course, then you don't get to hear the arguments for the specific form of punishment, and that's really nice.
They could not. They don't necessarily have to argue. They may not have a recommended punishment. There just might be a list of reasons why the punishment should be high, reasons why the punishment should be low.
Right, but the way I heard you say it before is recommending, let's say, a specific punishment, and that might be interesting too.
Yeah.
Right, as a kind of. I'm also wondering if how sometimes there's friends of the court brief filed. Now, I'm not an expert on this stuff. I don't know exactly how that works, but maybe sometimes there could be additional, just besides those two, other recommendations to the court. In fact, I mean, when someone's in sentencing, people write editorials about potentially what they think this person deserves.
Right. Those can be, basically, maybe there's a prosecutor's recommendation, the defender's recommendation, and then the popular recommendation.
Interesting, but popular recommendation.
Right, and that sort of incorporates all the editorials that get printed and the friend of the court briefs that get sent in.
Right, maybe we get potentially 3 or 4 different recommendations. It might really also depend on the case itself, right? And notice, right, and so in some of them, let's say you have this. So you have, let's say, these mitigating circumstances, right? Like this person has committed this crime before and received this punishment before. You want to know about that when sentencing them. Right. There's also things like what are the conditions under which this, it's interesting. So you think about the conditions of, this person, let's say, grew up in a family with domestic abuse and then committed the domestic abuse, right? And domestic abuse is one of those things that are generational, right? Yeah. That people kind of tend to do. Are you going to take that into consideration or not? Right, when sentencing, right, that they grew up in a family like that versus someone that didn't. What about?
And so I think that should definitely be on the list. That's the defender would say. Look, he grew up in a house where this generational abuse happened. This is why we're recommending that he has schooling instead of prison time.
Right. So
schooling instead of caning or whatever.
Right. So we want to make sure, right, that there's stuff like this. And I think there's also, here's a case that I've always thought was kind of interesting, right? I think a lot of times when it comes to punishment, and my father spent time in prison, in prison, not jail, prison, when I was in high school, and he did 15 months for a white collar crime, and. It always kind of reminds me, and I've talked to a lot of students when I do classes on, the criminal justice system, about, I had a student last semester whose father was on death row for a crime she said he didn't commit.
Wow.
right? And
That's rough.
right? Or students who, whose parents were, I had plenty of students whose parents were in jail. And just how much this impacts not just the person in jail, but also their family. And especially, and this is even more in Black communities, but I think it's true more generally, there's generalization. I don't think that's the right word. Where essentially one generation is in jail, and you're essentially leaving the next generation to have a lack of guidance, right? And it makes it much more likely that the next generation is in jail, and potentially the next one. And
so what you're talking about is the repercussions of your decisions.
Right. The repercussions, because
do we have, is the game big enough? Because that feels like a big scope.
Yes.
I mean, it's important, I think, but it also feels like I'm not sure how we would feed that back to the player.
I don't think you need to. I think the player just needs to consider, right? So look, I mean, if you let this person, let's say we were talking about domestic violence. If you're just letting this person just go back home, you got to think about the consequences. You might have more domestic violence, right? This could get dangerous, right? So, right, you got to think. So, as the person sentencing, you have to think about the potential consequences. We're not going to get to the actual consequences,
but I'm playing a game. If there's no actual consequences, then it's of no use to me.
Well, no. I mean, you still have your consequences are public opinion, and the consequence of your.
Well, that's why I brought in recidivism, because I think a recidivist, if the same criminal comes back to you having done something again,
right
after, then that should be a very big problem for you, popularity wise. Because the people you work for are like, hey, you didn't actually do your job here. This person didn't stop doing what they were doing.
But maybe that's not fair, right? I mean, look, in the court of public opinion, sure, I agree with you, right?
That's what I'm talking about,
right? But public opinion, the way you've had it up to this point, was essentially that it's kind of like the general opinion of what people, the way people answer these sorts of questions. Here, right, you can make you can make the smart decision and have it be the wrong decision. So here's what I mean by that, right? You can essentially make the smart, and this doesn't just apply to criminal justice. It could apply to anything, right? You can make let's say let's take the vaccination for COVID-19, right? You can say, look, I followed the science, and I listened to I listened to the CDC and to the great majority of experts in the field, and so I got the vaccine. And that was the smart decision. But, it might end up that the vaccine really wasn't ready and, really is at the end of the day going to kill you. It's possible. If that happens, you made the smart decision, but maybe not the right one.
Sure.
You see what I mean by that? Right?
Sure.
And normally what we want people to make the smart decisions, because the smart decisions are usually also the right decisions, but not always.
Right. Sure.
And you can have a judge where you essentially made the decision.
But that means that from the game point of view, it means that we have to decide as game designers what the right decision is before we give it to the player. And I don't think we want to do that.
No, we don't want to do that.
We don't want to do that at all.
No, we don't want to do that at all.
So all we have is a consistent decision as judged by your wife, and a popular decision as judged by, this other judgment,
by other people.
Survey that we send out, right?
Right. Though, I like the idea, by the way, of at least one of your cases coming back and kind of seeing what you do with that. But I don't think we should treat that case any differently. I think, in terms of mechanics, I think it's a different challenge for a person to think about, a case that they themselves kind of decided. Yeah.
It can also be that, we don't necessarily, a case comes before us that has a guy that has been convicted of this crime before.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily mean that we convicted him before, but we can see what the other judge.
But there's also something pretty special about, I think, someone that you made the decision about.
Yeah,
coming back.
I think so too.
Right?
I would love to see that and have once in a while somebody comes back into your frame of reference, either as another case, or maybe he comes back as one of the lawyers. Maybe they come back maybe they just write you a letter. They say, hey, you did me a good turn. I got my life squared away. I am now, happily married with 3 children and whatever.
Yeah, interesting. This idea of getting letters, right? You can get
Right. Some judges do.
They do. So you can get it from victims or from or from the criminals themselves, right? But potentially both. Yeah, that's interesting. Or family members,
and that could be sort of randomly generated to a certain degree, just to give you another point of like personal juicy touch.
And the fact that
these are real people that you're affecting.
Yeah, that you're impacting like real people. Oh, by the way, so the example I was thinking about earlier for like the kind of cases is, and this kind of has to do with consistency, right? So let's say 2 people rob a store at gunpoint, right? And we'll keep everything else the same, except to say that one of them has a young child at home, right? And let's say they're a single parent, and the other one does not. Right. Are you going to treat those 2 cases differently? Right. That child now is going to, if you send this person to jail for a long time, that child would grow up probably in the foster system, possibly with another relative. If we can make this any way we want. But notice it's a really kind of interesting, and maybe this is something that maybe we haven't talked about that I would like to kind of, as part of wrapping up the game, right? I'd like the players to kind of think about what at the end of the day they think their philosophy on criminal justice would be, right? So, for example, do they think, for example, that the goal of punishment should be to give people what they deserve, or should the goal of punishment be to, let's say, create a better society?
Right.
Now, and notice, by the way, those 2 things are easily put in conflict, right? So if you take the example I just gave you, right?
Sure.
The person with the kid, right? You might say they deserve the same punishment as the person without the kid. But if you're trying to make a better society, you should give them a lighter punishment, because you should think about the consequences to that kid. Right? And how they're going to be different. So there's a bunch of cases that you can do that might either show which direction you're going to, right? And maybe that could be calculated. What your practiced philosophy, let's say, was. There's also things like, and I would love to kind of bring this in some way, the idea of the decarceration movement. So this would be people like Angela Davis that essentially say that we have this problem where we just turn around and jail everybody.
Yeah.
The United States has way more people in jail than every other, Western country. Some like 10 times more, I think, than the UK, or 5 or 7 times more.
Yeah. It's ridiculous. We have more people in jail than a lot of countries have people.
Yes. But of course, we have a lot of people too. Right. But yes, we have usually about 2.1, something like that, million people in jail, prison. Yeah. And then we have all those people on probation. And then, of course, we also have juvenile, and it'd be nice to have some juvenile stuff in there as well. Sure. Right. But the idea there is essentially to try to do investments in communities and kind of realize how much jail specifically harms communities, right? And of course, he's focused on the black community, but this idea that you're kind of breaking up a community and you're not allowing a community to become healthy. And if you had healthier communities that had more services, better education, you would more unity. Right, more safety in the first place. Right, you would get less crime in the first place, and then you would need less prisons. Right, and you would essentially get a virtuous cycle there. So I'd love some way for those ideas to kind of also make it in there.
Yeah, I feel like I feel like it's by placing it in the U.S. So if we say that this is all happening in the U.S., we can't talk about this without talking about the Black community and what police were originally designed for, and what they and what the prisons, what's happening in the prisons right now in regards to the just a sheer volume of number of Black people incarcerated.
Right. So this is another possible thing, right? That can go in there, right? As you're sentencing, right? Being aware,
Right.
that
It's almost like we can't. I don't. It's such an important part of the reality of that.
right.
That I kind of, if we just want to talk about a more general thing, I think it pulls focus
Away from the general thing in some sense.
and it should, right? I mean,
Right.
we should be talking about those things. We absolutely should be. But if we're not making an activist game, and we decided we were not,
Right. Then you
then
just
I
want to
really
think in
think
general
that
principles.
we need to talk about general principles
Right.
without the weight of this huge thing that we have to acknowledge.
Yeah, though I don't think you need to get rid of decarceration idea completely. I think
No.
something like that can still go in there, but you're right, because then you're dealing with a very kind of specific problem that seems to have much more like solutions that are available instead of
Right.
principles that we need to consider.
That's right.
Right. Okay, I'm with you. I'm with you on that.
Yeah, and all of that can factor in also into this popularity issue. So because we're asking 1,000 people in a survey, how would they resolve this case, or whether or not the way that this judge resolved the case is a good thing or a bad thing. We can build those things into that, where this 1,000 people are going to be 1,000 Americans that we ask, and and the decarceration can be part of that, be part of the popularity system. Then that's going to be, all of those things are going to make that judge a more popular judge. And in a world where that's a not very popular idea, that'll make that judge an unpopular judge.
Okay. All right. Though I definitely want to. I think I like this idea of not being an American game.
Okay.
Yeah, I think because why restrict it to because
Well,
I mean,
we're
we
already
could.
breaking the law. We're already breaking the rules about how judges actually work in America.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
We're telling them that they have carte blanche.
Right.
Here's, they don't have a constitution to worry about.
No juries.
So we're
to
already
actually decide.
saying it's not U.S.
Right.
It's some other westernized but racially mixed world.
Sure. Though again, yeah, it's interesting if we're bringing things like race and sex into it at all. And yeah, that's because race.
And we should.
Well, but then you have so much localized context, which is, the picture without bringing race and sex into it is incomplete, right? But the picture, if you do bring race and sex into it, is very particular, and localized. So I think again, for an activist game, I think that was a kind of good way to call it. For an activist game, I think I would definitely do it.
Yeah,
but,
for sure.
But maybe
for
for the game we've kind of created at this point, I would keep it out.
Well, but each of these people is a specific person, right? And so we want the player to understand them to be specific people.
I see. So right. So
that means that they have to have have a racial and gender identity, I think.
Okay. Yeah. I mean that's fine. It's just that if whatever thought process there is to be had about that, we would leave that to the player.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We'd leave it to the player and leave it to the judging public,
right.
well, and just let that sit out there and let that change over time. Because here's the other thing about this game, and I really like this game. I'm looking at our time. We should probably wrap up here in a minute. So I think we've got a design.
Yeah. Oh,
I think we have a rough design. This is
a totally doable game, by the way.
It's perfectly doable. Yeah, absolutely doable. It's a game in which the player acts as a judge, a sentencing judge specifically, in which they have a free range of possibilities for the kinds of sentences that they can enact on these different cases. They're given a series of cases. Maybe there might be 1,000 different cases. The game is designed for kids age 15 as they go through a civics class or a government class in high school. So it's meant to be played by kids as part of school, but of course we can't control the context of that. So they may or may not get any extra education about civics from the classroom. We just have to assume that what they have in front of them in the computer is what they have. As they make judgments on these cases, as they sentence these criminals to various things, and they have everything from no sentence to a very light sentence, all the way down to a death penalty or caning or who knows? We could have a pretty big
chemical
list
castration.
Of things. Chemical castration, that used to be a thing.
That still is a thing.
I guess it probably is in some places. Amputation is still a thing in certain places. So they have all of these options. Some of them are going to be consistent with their philosophy, and which is basically just consistent with their previous, everything that they've previously done. And other things are going to be popular or unpopular. So there's two ways of judging them. And one way to lose the game, which is pitchforks and riots. Pitchforks and torches, you become too unpopular, and the crowd removes you from office. Is there a spouse way to lose the game? Is there a way for your...
your spouse is disgusted by you and divorces you. Yeah.
And divorces you. Okay.
Yeah.
You're not the person I married.
Exactly.
You've changed.
Well, you were put to the test.
Yep.
And you failed. You showed yourself not to be a person of good moral fiber. Right.
And honestly, this sounds like a game that I would absolutely play.
Me too.
So awesome. Nice work, Shlomo.
All right, nice work, Andy. All right, good podcast, GP.
GP.
Play nice, everybody.